Good morning, everybody. My name is Johnny Sutton. I am an alumni with the Texas Lyceum, class of 2006. I'm welcoming all the Texas Lyceum directors, alumni, and guests to week 2 of our September conference. We should have been in Beaumont, Texas to do this in person, but the coronavirus had other plans, so we're doing it on Zoom. We had a great week last week, and you're going to hear some from great panels today. The panel you're getting ready to hear right now is from the Executive Director of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. That's the prison system, the parole system, and the probation system, Brian Collier. I'm going to introduce him in just a moment. As you know, the Lyceum is all about questions and answers, and this is really a great opportunity to talk to somebody that knows more about Texas prisons than probably anybody in the world. And I'll give you you'll understand that in a second when I introduce him from his bio. But we really encourage everybody to ask questions. Brian is going to give a short presentation, then I'm going to ask a few questions, and then very quickly we want to get to y'all's questions. And I'll see those on my screen, and I'll ask as many as I can. And ask whatever's on your mind. We know these are interesting and controversial times, so this is a great opportunity for us to learn about the Texas prison system and ask questions. So please put those in the Q&A tab. You're going to also have a chat tab where you can talk to each other throughout this conference, but for your questions, it'll be easier for me to see them if y'all put them in the Q&A tab. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to y'all Brian Collier, who is the Executive Director of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. We'll be calling that TDCJ. Brian has been with the Texas prison system for 35 years. He started as a clerk at the age of 20 years old back in 1985. He's been a prison guard. He's been a parole officer. He's been a unit supervisor. He was in charge of the entire parole division. In 2007, he became the Deputy Executive Director, which was basically the right-hand man for Brad Livingston, who was the director for many years and did a great job. And Brian was a huge part of the success that TDCJ has had over these years. He has a degree in criminology and corrections from Sam Houston State University. And there truly is no one better qualified in the world to tell us and teach us about Texas prisons. Welcome, Brian, and take over and let's hear your presentation, and then we'll go to question and answers.
Good morning. Thank you, Johnny, and good morning to everyone. I'm going to quickly walk through a brief overview of just TDCJ and show you a little bit about the agency, but also some of the trends that have happened in the agency over the last 10 years so that you can see some of the number trends that we'll be talking about today. First thing I'm going to do, and Johnny did it in the introduction, he talked about TDCJ. Most people think when they hear the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, think we're just prisons. We're certainly not just prisons. We're prisons. We're also parole supervision, and we also provide adult or oversight for the adult probation system in Texas. We do reentry, we do rehabilitative programs, lots of other things in between, but we're certainly more than just a prison system. We are the largest state prison system in the country. We have nearly 34,000 employees, about 88% of which work with our offender population either in our institutions or out on supervision. And you can see the two big categories of employees that we have, correctional officers being over 20,000 of those right now, and over 1,300 parole officers right now. If you look at community supervision and think about what goes on in community supervision and probation specifically, there are 122 local probation departments in Texas supervising just under 200,000 probationers. That's 144,000 felony and 54,000 misdemeanors. Also, 67 district parole offices around the state of Texas supervising 84,000 individuals on parole supervision. We also operate substance abuse treatment facilities in Texas. We have SAFE-P programs, are the acronym, but it's substance abuse felony punishment facilities. Those are intensive drug treatment facilities that last 6 to 9 months in an incarceration setting. And then when people graduate, they go out for 12 months of aftercare and they're on supervision at that time and probation typically. We also operate the state jail system in Texas. And that's not local county jails. That is a state jail system within the adult criminal justice system for offenders sentenced to low-level drug and property crimes with a maximum sentence of 2 years. If you look at our just prison population in Texas, those are sentences from 2 years to life and or death, and we have 117,000 in prison today. Next, I'm going to walk you through some trends. And these are just going to give you the snapshot 10 years ago and what we look like today. First would be just looking at numbers that have decreased. 10 years ago in Texas, we operated 113 facilities. That's secure facilities or prisons. Today, we have 101. Those others have been closed. Next, you can see the population numbers. 154,000 10 years ago. Today, 121,000. Now, I will tell you at the 121 number is somewhat influenced by COVID, because during the COVID event, we stopped intake from local county jails. But if you take that into consideration, our count prior to COVID, or going back to February of this year, was around 142,000. Based on where we are, we don't anticipate going back to the 142, probably until 23, if at all, depending on how the courts respond post-COVID. State jail offenders, 10 years ago, we had 12,122. Today, we have 2,326 state jail offenders in the system. 10 years ago, we had 8,500 people in what's called restrictive housing or administrative segregation. Today, that number is 4,697. The recidivism rate 10 years ago, and this is calculated by, in Texas, the Legislative Budget Board, and it's based off people returning to prison within a 3-year window. So 10 years ago, 27.2% of those released actually returned to the system within a 3-year window. The most recent recidivism study, 20.3%. That's what the recidivism rate is at this time. Parole revocations, another area of decreases, 7,149 10 years ago. Today, 5,932 parole revocations. That's all the decrease, not all the decreases, but the big decreases I wanted to show you. I also want to show you increases of things inside the system. Even though we have gotten smaller, we are at the same time having to adjust to population changes. 10 years ago, 12,000 people over 55. Today, 19,123. That number was a little over 20 pre-COVID. If you look at our mentally ill offenders, 21,725, that number 22,949, and that number was closer to 25,000 pre-COVID. If you look at the number of violent offenders and you're not seeing a real fight, that's actually just a photo that we took for purposes. 51.2 10 years ago, today 62.4% of our offender population are violent. Number of parolees, 80,000 10 years ago, today that number is just under 84,000 on supervision. Just a quick run through, and that'll be the last of my slide, Johnny, and I'll stop there, but I wanted to kind of give that perspective, because obviously we've had a lot of change in the last 10 years, but as we see that change, we've also seen decreases, but increases in other categories.
Right. Thank you so much, Brian. That was very helpful to see. And so it looks like there's been some dramatic changes in prison. Back in my day, there was, and when I say my day, just many of y'all know I'm a former prosecutor from Harris County and a longtime federal prosecutor. And I also worked for 5 years with Governor Bush as his criminal justice policy director. So that was 95 to 2000 when a lot of the building was going on and there were some changes. So Brian and I have known each other a long time. I guess what I wanted to start out with, Brian, first question is kind of the big question in my mind, and it's sort of how we titled this conference, the business of prisons, the business of incarceration. You know, that kind of strikes me as a funny way to phrase it, knowing what I know, but tell us about that. That's really, I think, the main thrust of this right. Panel, in fact, the entire conference is, you know, is Texas making a lot of money off the prison industry, and do we want more prisoners in so we can make more money, or is there another story that doesn't get told very much? So if you could address that, that would really be helpful.
I think if the latter were true, we're not doing a very good job at it,
right.
Because we've been going in the reverse direction. But I think the way I would explain our role, and it's the system, is really we're a public safety entity. Well, we as a prison system provide public safety. Community supervision, we provide public safety. But you've got to look at public safety a little differently. Public safety is incarceration, and I certainly understand that. And there are definitely people in prison that need to be kept away from the general public. And we work with those as well. But if you think about it, those that we can provide the opportunities for rehabilitation, treatment programming, and others that help them be successful upon release, that's, to me, the bigger public safety goal you have. And I think that's what we work to strive for, whether it's probation. And on the probation end, you want to defer and keep people from coming into the system, if at all possible. So you put the tools there to hopefully do that. In prison, you provide the tools and the foundation for people to make a life change and make adjustments and continue to move in the right direction, and you help them do that. And I think we've done a good job in Texas of doing that. And then on parole supervision, you follow that through with effective ways of getting them reintegrated into the community, getting them working, getting them back into the community, keeping them stable as it relates to prior addictions and other things in their lives. But at the same time, getting them up and running so that if they live in a neighborhood near you or I, we're not going to be scared of them anymore because they have been through it. And that's the public safety goal I think we all have. And this really is a people business. It has many aspects of it. But again, in Texas, what we've seen is really a sustained effect of a substantial investment in treatment, programming, and diversion programs that was made many, many years ago and has been kept in place and only built on top of. We've enhanced it as we could, but that's helped us reduce substantially our populations, close prisons, and really start making a difference in the system with people's lives.
Yeah, that's very impressive and very different from when I was back in state government. Well, talk to us. I think you said that the highest you had 113 units. That's down to 101 now. How many of those units are private? I mean, what if someone said, I've heard the term, prison industrial complex. I recently watched the movie 13th, that made the argument that, it's almost a new type of slavery or Jim Crow in some ways. Talk to us about that. Give us the realities of private, how much of the Texas prison system is private, how self-sufficient are you, and maybe even give us some history of that if you could.
Sure, you bet. If you Texas, we have private prisons in Texas, and we've had them since the 80s. And Texas was legislated to get into the private prison business, essentially. We had state law that required us to enter into an agreement to operate private prisons. We have 10 private prisons in Texas. Now, the state of Texas built and owns 9 of those 10. So those are our facilities where we're paying an operator to come in and actually operate the facility based on our standards. And I would tell you that number, we have closed several that were operated by privates. We've actually idled one this year that is operated by a private vendor. However, in Texas, and I'm not here to argue pro or con privatization, but I will tell you our experience of privatization and the private facilities that we've operated with and the vendors we've worked with has been a good balance for Texas. And it's not an apples to apples. We don't take our maximum security prisoners and put them into private beds and try to see if we can balance that and do it the same way. But we can identify people that are lower risk who potentially are in treatment programs and other areas that can do well in the setting of a private prison. And we have also found that vendors have done a very good job of providing some of the intensive treatment programming that we offer. So a lot of the treatment programming we offer, we may offer it on our prison, we may operate the prison, but we may have a vendor that actually helps operate the substance abuse treatment program. And we found that to be a good balance. I think the key is using it where there is an opportunity to help it be effective. You certainly, in my opinion, you don't want to privatize lots of your system, but I think having a balance of that can work and can work well. And I think for some states, it also provides an opportunity for them if they have expansion issues quickly and they don't have any way to grow fast because populations sometimes catch you before you're able to build and catch up to it, that they can provide an opportunity. But in Texas, largely we own the facility, they operate the facility, we regulate them very closely with contracts and contract monitoring that's very tight. And we continue to do that. We have requirements that make them meet everything we do. So their officers, their staff have to do everything our staff do, have to be trained the same, have to do all the same requirements. And I think in the right environment, it can work well. And I can say we've had I think a fair experience with the privatization in Texas. I've seen obviously other states. In Texas, over the history of 30 years, there's been bumps and bruises, but overall, the number of private prisons has dropped some in Texas, but at the same time, the balance we're at now seems to work fairly well. And again, I think in certain pockets, it can work. I think you have to be careful not to try to compare it equally because it's not necessarily apples and apples when you look at who's incarcerating or who you're holding in your facilities as it goes there.
And I guess the units, the 10 units that we have, are those all low security units? I assume these are not maximum security units where you've got more dangerous prisoners. Is that right?
they're smaller, you're lower security, or they're in the largest of our privates is actually a diversion facility. So it's a treatment program that also handles probationers that need to be redirected, as well as some other categories. But I think in not maximum security, I would agree. But I think, and I'm not saying they couldn't do that. I think you would just have to structure it differently, and then you obviously would have some other factors to weigh. But for us, it's lower risk facilities, smaller facilities where it has proven to be a good model.
Well, that's a lot different than I saw in this movie I watched recently. Well, let's talk a little bit about history, if you don't mind. And
Yeah.
I don't want to put you in an area you don't know as well, but I remember when I was in high school, graduated from high school in Houston in 1979, and there were 740 murders my senior year of high school. I mean, I think people forget how dangerous certain cities were in Houston and around the United States, where today the city's grown by millions. And I think the number of murders is around 300 or so. It may be slightly rising because we're seeing some blips going up. But that's just a dramatic difference. And I remember when I started in the DA's office, 10-year sentence in TDCJ meant 10 months. In fact, some of the prisoners would argue you'd give them 2 years in TDCJ and they'd say, well, I want 3. And I'd say, why do you want 3? Why would you want more than 2? They said, because if I get 3, I go to TDCJ and they'll parole me out immediately. But if I get 2, I stay in the county jail and I'll do more time. I also remember when the 3G offense came in. Some of y'all may know what that is, but I think that might be important if you're comfortable explaining it. You know, how did y'all stop that revolving door? Why were those prisons built? And also any theories you have why we're seeing this prison population drop so dramatically when it was rising so aggressively in the late 70s, early 80s, and up to early 90s.
You bet. And I started in the system in the mid 80s. Obviously, I was a clerk. I wasn't seeing the system as a system, but looking back on it today, I can kind of look at that and piece together some of what you're talking about as well. And if you look at the 80s, the system was overcrowded, and we were also dealing with a crack epidemic, if you remember, in the cities around Texas and around the country. And for the response to crack was incarceration. So you had, by the time we got to the late 80s in Texas, you had overcrowded prisons, and you also had overcrowded county jails. And the way the state dealt with that at that time was to open the gate of releasing to try to relieve some of that pressure. So your parole rates went as high as 70% approval rates in the late 80s, early 90s. And then we also, matter of fact, I did it myself. When I was a parole officer, I worked out of the Harris County Jail downtown, interviewing people for parole who were never going to make it to prison because the line was so long and it took so long to get there. Right. And we would actually process people for parole and actually release them there at North Franklin in Houston out of the county jail. And we did that to the tune of over 10,000 releases at the peak of that. But what began to happen in the late 80s is Texas began to build some prisons. That takes a while. It takes usually 2 to 4 years to build a facility, depending on how large your facility is going to be. But as we rolled into the early 90s, they continued building the system. They redesigned the penal code in the early 90s and created the state jail felonies from the 4th degree and modified that. But then they also put on the ground new facilities all the way up to around 1996, where we were opening several facilities a year all over the state of Texas. So they were able to relieve the county jails. And we kind of swung totally the other way because we had been running as much as a 70% parole approval rate, and we went down to the very low 20s or even high teens at that time because we brought all those offenders into prison. We had them here, and the parole board was very, very conservative for a long period of time. We did have some treatment, but not substantial amounts of treatment. But there was some available. As we continued to trickle through the late 90s, those kind of settled down somewhat. And the parole board, I think, got somewhere comfortable and was still pretty conservative, but at the same time, some treatment in place, but not substantial. But there were some of the intensive substance abuse treatment programs that you see, as well as others. In 2000, so jump ahead to 2000s, where we're running in the 150s on our population, 150,000 plus. The legislature, at that time, the LBB, the Legislative Budget Board, is predicting we're going to need 11,000 more beds based on the route we're headed. The legislature in Texas did an interesting experiment, and it wasn't really an experiment because they had plans both ways. They set money aside to do the build of prisons if necessary, and then they also invested substantially in treatment and diversion programs. And treatment being for those in prison, but also the diversion being to keep those from coming in or those that are having struggles on supervision to have some other opportunity. That was put in place in 2007, And those have sustained since '07 and also have been enhanced, and we've built upon those. They were DWI treatment programs. They were other intensive substance abuse treatment programs that already had a track record of success. They just expanded the volume of those beds and gave really the parole board and judges some tools that I think were well needed. And I think slowly that began to take an effect. And I think by 2008, 9, 10, we began to see that we could close, we could drop some facilities. But interestingly, even though we've hit some rough economic times, and we're going to hit one now, those items continue to remain off the table as it comes to making cuts. They have stayed in place, and that I think has helped us have really a sustained effect of how we've lowered the population, because you've seen effective treatment inside helping those be more successful when they get out, and then you've seen effective treatment programming coming in that avoids anyone coming to prison in the first place. And I think the other piece is, and you have to look at this when you're looking at the numbers, your revocations from probation and parole, which drive a lot of your prison population. If you can give judges other options that have teeth that also are effective, you can help them address those populations in another way. And that's what we did as well. And I think those combined effects, as well as just the overall criminal justice reforms that have happened over the last 10 to 15 years, have helped drop the system numbers. And I think we're, to some degree, we right-sized, and then we have kind of continued to settle, because we came up from the 80s essentially building to meet a need, and then you settle down as that need goes away. And then as the system continues, I think you've built a lot of capacity, and obviously you can either fill that or move the other direction. And fortunately, we have to a large degree tried to move the other direction.
That's great. Could you tell us the racial makeup of the population of TDCJ, so we can understand if you track that, how it breaks down by race, and give us an idea of the populations in prison. Are they mainly, I hear from my legalizer friend, there's millions and millions of people in prison for mere possession of marijuana, which I know is false, but
Right.
Give us an idea of, what kind of prisoner you've got in there and sort of the trends you're seeing, racial, crime breakdown, and maybe even ages.
Yeah, let me give you and I'll just kind of give you let me give you the racial breakdown, because most people don't, I've seen that change over my career significantly as well, to where we are today is almost an even divide among white, black, Hispanic. It's literally 33, 33, 33. It's very close, very little difference in the race barrier today. There's obviously a larger number of other people from other races, but at the same time, if you break down the typical white, black, Hispanic, you're going to see those numbers very, very close together. And that's something that has changed over the years in our system, and has definitely reduced. If you look at those that are violent in prison, is 62%. Those property crimes, just under a little over 9%. Drug and other offenses make up about 28%. So what we've seen in the prison population, and you see that when I gave the slides about the older population, you've seen a lot of offenders who got long sentences for very violent offenses who have remained in the system and haven't necessarily gotten out on parole supervision, who are still here. But that older population makes up even a higher percentage of that violent pool than the overall 62%. But we've seen it grow from, you see less and less of the drug offenders. Now you see those in your state jail populations. So if you look at our state jail numbers, which are relatively low, you do see a higher percentage of those either being property or drug. And unfortunately, those sentences are very short. So the average time we have an offender in state jail is usually 7 to 9 months. And if you look in Texas, if you look at who's coming to state jail, a lot of those are your meth addicts. They're on methamphetamine, they're coming in, they're not going to take your treatment option in the community. They're going to plea for the straight time because in their world, it may feel easier.
Right.
Unfortunately, that may not be the best outcome for all of us, because many of them return right back to what they were doing when they get out, and there's no supervision with state jail.
Now we're at 8:25, and I really want to get to Lyceum members' questions, and I encourage y'all out there to present questions. I've got a couple up, at least one up on my screen, and I've got a ton of questions. I can certainly go the whole time, but I really want to try to open it to the group. So at 8:30, I'm going to start asking some Lyceum member questions. One thing that may be on folks' mind is, give us a quick report on what the COVID-19 situation is inside TDCJ. Have you lost prisoners? Have you lost staff? What's the current status of that?
Yes, we, like a lot of systems, I think every system's had COVID in the country, but it's been a substantial impact on us since March. We have uh, worked diligently. It's been our front focal the whole entire time since March. We continue to stay focused on it, but at the same time, we have lost definitely significant number of offenders, over 150 that we know were COVID positive, who also passed away during this event. Many of those from our older populations with other health conditions, but nonetheless positive with COVID. We've also identified, we've had 20 of our staff members who have passed away due to COVID, who were officers, many of them officers. We've had a couple of chaplains who passed away, but we have continued to follow, like I think most states are, but we have followed the CDC guidelines throughout. We've done, the disinfecting, the protective equipment, we're masking. We made masks in early March when we couldn't get masks. So our offenders and staff have been in masks since early April. We have continued. Our two healthcare partners are the University of Texas Medical Branch and Texas Tech Health Science Center. They provide the medical services on our facilities and have done a phenomenal job of providing those services. We've done the protocols about isolating and moving people that are exposed so that we don't continue to cause spread in our facilities. We've done substantial testing. We've tested more than anyone in the country. By far, we've done well over 220,000 tests in the system. And we've done that to really go out and find the asymptomatics. And we have learned, as many people have learned by now, about 80% of what we find in our system are asymptomatic positives. We've always maintained the symptomatic people that have symptoms, they're seen by medical isolated. But at the same time, when we see that, we go in and do mass testing of those facilities, and we find large numbers of asymptomatic, which makes it a very difficult ghost to catch because staff members, even though we test them regularly and require the protocols with masks, any of us, unfortunately, could be infected and not know it, depending on the circumstances. So we stopped intake, visitation, things like that. We're beginning to try to get back to normal. We're now back into bringing in intake with a quarantine model and doing screening at the county jail and screening here when we get as well. Working through that to hopefully bring in everyone by the end of the year that's been out in the county jails. We had to suspend placement into programs during the event. We've addressed that and put our offenders back into program. The ones that were enrolled stayed enrolled, and we moved to a correspondence model, but we weren't able to do movement because we stopped moving from facility to facility. But we've re-engaged that with a much slower model. Of course, transporting, we do half of what we used to do to space out. We do spacing where we can inside the facilities. So lots as we've learned, but at the same time, as we continue to grow with it, right now our focus is on getting flu shots to everyone in the population and getting everyone on staff to get their flu shots, so we're prepared for what's coming. But right now our numbers are in better shape than they've been in several months. So we've leveled off, we've slowed down, much like the state of Texas has. But our overall numbers are good at this time, but we're not thinking that's going to last. So we're getting prepared for what may be next.
Yeah, what a challenge. That's amazing. All right, let me jump to some Lyceum questions. The first one, it's great to see so many of the numbers on the decline. What does the curve look like per capita, and how does Texas's curve compare to other states? What does the curve look like per capita, and how does Texas's curve compare to other states? Does that make sense?
I would think, when I'll answer it this way, Johnny, because I won't claim to be the mathematician that may be on the other end of that. So what I would say is you see many states that are, but it's all about the state criminal justice dynamics, because right now as we speak, there are states who are similar to Texas that have had good experiences by being able to close and reduce the size of their system. But you've got other states that are scrambling for beds. And there's also some states that have actually begun a process of rehabilitation and programming and other steps that have backtracked on that based on an event or based on a series of events that have happened, because someone may get out and there may be a bad offense, and then as a result they kind of snap back and begin to come back in. So you see a lot of states that have gone through justice investment with council state governments and other nonprofits that go in and help states redesign how they do their business, and they're doing well. But you don't consistently see it across 50 states where you're closing facilities. You do see some states that are just going absolutely in the other direction, but it's really based upon their local or their state politics as it relates to how they sentence offenders and how they're dealing with criminal justice issues.
That's great. Okay, next question. What type of Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for your presentation. Would you please speak to your process of restorative justice? Is that, quote, diversion, or is that a separate process?
I think it has to be intertwined in what you're doing really throughout, because you've got to be victim-centered as you do your probation diversions. You also have to keep into account, because our responsibility is to the public, but our responsibility is equally to victims, and victims are a key piece of our business. Understanding them, making sure they're part of the process, but then also educating and working with them on the processes that we have in place, because many of our crime victims obviously want to have a very close say in what happens to the one that may have assaulted or injured them. But at the same time, what we have seen over and over continued is those victims understand that if we are able to successfully reintegrate someone, we all benefit from that, versus just locking someone up forever, and then when they get out, they're under no supervision and no rules. So we've had good success, I think, managing that with the victims. We offer victim mediation and do lots of things with our victim services division of TDCJ to provide and give victims a voice, not only with a parole board, but within the system, and try to keep them as a key component. So I think understanding what restorative justice is trying to restore as if, getting you back to where you fixed what happened, and address that as well with that victim. And we try hard to do that throughout the system.
Okay, now another question, and then if we get, I think there's going to be a bunch here. Let's move as fast as we can. It's 8:32 and time is moving. What type of programs is TDCJ doing to implement, either directly or through working with community partners, to help decrease the number of repeat offenders returning to prison?
The biggest, I would say, several categories. We obviously operate a substantial number of substance abuse treatment programs. We do that. We do those programs based on best practices, not only in what we've learned, but also what other states are doing, and learning and trying to sharpen our knife all the time as it relates to how we do that. Many of those programs have aftercare components or follow through when you're on supervision, because going through treatment in prison is one thing, but actually applying it when you get out is a totally different thing. And being able to reinforce that with aftercare is key. Another key piece of the puzzle to me, and we've worked on it significantly with reentry inside and out, providing the documents, social security card, birth certificate, the state identification card when you walk out the door, and then plugging you into jobs. Because we have, pre-COVID, we were doing better at securing jobs for offenders than I've seen in my entire career. And we have more employers over the last 5 years that are willing to enter a discussion into hiring people from prison than ever before. And I think our goal has been to, one, court those employers, but also work closely with them to make sure they have a good experience. And at the same time, then plug in other people to those jobs, because in a way, it's not that, it is complicated, but it's not. To me, you get someone out of prison and we can get them working quickly, get their residential status secure, and then keep them clean. We've got most of the battle won. And do that over time, and you stay consistent. You can get someone in the habit of doing that, and that's their regular routine, and that works out well for them. So employment has been a key piece of our focus for the last several years, and we've done it with our reentry division in and out, having kind of a marriage of those within our parole offices. We have reentry case managers that work in our parole offices, as well as those on our prison units that kind of do the inside work and plug them in before they get out.
This question is for me, because when you talk about felons getting out, I mean, most of these folks are getting out. I want to say the average sentence is around 5 years. So the idea that, there's some that are locked up for a long time, but most are coming out and they're going to have an X on their back as a felon. Mm-hmm. Is there any thinking, or do you have an idea about how, it sounds like y'all are doing a good job of getting them jobs, but I'm sure there's some employers and probably even some housing situations, apartments, that don't want that ex-con. And of course, there's a lot of times that question is on the application. There's debate about whether, my instinct is be honest about it. Say, yes, I was selling drugs. I got caught. I went to prison. I did my time. I did everything they asked me to do. And now give me a second chance. And I think we are a country that does give second chances, but I think we're also a country that's very afraid of getting sued. Is there something that you could do for employers and apartment complexes that would give them a little bit of liability protection and make them more confident that when they are given a second chance, if something goes wrong, they're not going to get sued? Do you know anything about that?
As far as the liability or the lawsuit or giving them some kind of immunity from that I don't know, but I do know that the housing is a significant issue. That's very legit and an issue that we bump into all the time as far as post-release housing, because many apartment complexes don't want felons in there, and that's part of their screening process. But there are those that do, and what you find, unfortunately, is you'll find large numbers sometimes of people with a background at those locations because they're the ones that are an opportunity.
Right.
And then sometimes the media will play that, and then that becomes an issue in a local community. To me, that is a legitimate factor. From the employment standpoint, we take the same approach that we need to be upfront about who we are. We need to not be scared to say, I've been to prison, but this is what I got from prison. Here's my certification on welding. Here's my certification on this. Here's how I applied that skill. Here's someone you can call at the prison to tell you how well I did, and try to make sure that we put that best foot forward as we get out. And we work with the Texas Department of Licensing as well on those that are eligible for licensing. And we found that in most occasions, they're able to work through the process to obtain ultimately their license. It may not be on the first pass, but they've done a good job of having a review process in place for those as well. But I think for us, we brought employers into our factories. We've showed them what we do. We've modified our processes to sync up more with what current employers are doing so that we bring a workforce to the table that's ready. And that's been a plus. Truck driving, lots of other categories that we do. We train offenders in truck driving, and then we allow them to use that skill while they're here. And then that enhances it. We do evaluations, and then we provide that to employers as we get out. So we're able to plug them in as well that way.
Brian, this doesn't sound like a great business of incarceration and how you're making great profits off these prisoners, but maybe we'll get to that part. This next question I love because it's from one of the most brilliant Lyceum directors, and it starts out, "Great job, Johnny." So I love that. What issues, reforms, changes does Mr. Collier anticipate will impact their budget in the next 5 years? Example, aging population. And Brian, let's try to move a little fast. We got about 22 minutes. I want to hit as many questions as we can go.
Gotcha. Biggest issue as it relates to the aging population is going to be healthcare cost. That cost continues to go up. It has gone up every year that I can count back. It continues to be a significant driver in the system. That population remains more of a violent background, a lot of sex offenders. So it's not a population that's easy when you want to have the discussion about should we let those out into the community. That may be a cheaper way to go about doing it. So that'll continue to be a factor. I think that the overall cost of the workforce and the fact that we may not be able to attract the large numbers of employees we need to operate the system means we need to become somewhat less reliant on physical people if we can find other ways to use either technology or other opportunities to kind of shrink the workforce. But that's not, you can't knock it off substantially, but you can make some efforts there, I think, as well.
Okay, here's a question. Sounds like a question I'd ask. Is the critique of the quote prison industrial complex an unfair or incomplete characterization of the system? And since this is kind of what this conference is about, we've hit it a few times. Is there anything else you'd want to say about that critique and some of the ideas that, you know, we want big prison populations because we make money off it?
I don't understand that concept. And I work closely with other directors in other states, and I know those individuals, and I know they're not of that mindset either. So we receive we don't design the system. We receive product of the system essentially, and then we try to work with what we get to help that be a better outcome when we go down the road for that person to be released. So, and I see that throughout the country with other directors. So we sometimes get pushed in a corner and we have to grow because of other activities, but we don't control that aspect of it. So I think for us, that's not necessarily, I don't know that mentality or that thought, and I don't understand it personally, because I mean, for us, success is public safety and people not coming back to prison, or if they're not going to get out of prison, keeping them safely away from the public. And we try to do both of those well.
Another Lyceum director question. If you fell into some unexpected funding, which program would you put it towards first?
I would look at the front end of the system on the probation end and look at providing some more intensive treatment programs on the front end in the area of mental health and as well as substance abuse. I think, for instance, your second-time DWI offenders who are still a misdemeanor, if you could provide intensive treatment for those people, you might not see them as number 3 because you will see them usually as the third DWI coming to prison. So I think there are certain areas where you could catch and treat and work effectively with people in the community and keep them from coming in the front door.
Next question, what is your view of the efforts to increase pay to prisoners for their work, pros and cons? It's my understanding that Texas is one of the few prisons in the country that does not pay prisoners for their time. And I know that's by legislation, that's not your call. The legislature tells you that, but give us the pros and cons of paying prisoners. Is that a good idea, bad idea?
I don't think, to me, Texas, we don't pay offenders, but that's not by TDCJ saying, hey, we don't want to pay offenders. That's not our policy statement, not our practice. That's how we work.
Right.
We're not funded to pay prisoners. So if you want to pay offenders, I see a positive incentive in that. I see that earning money in the system that could be used to help you have a base when you get out, as well as maybe being able to provide some support for those that you need to provide support to while you're incarcerated can be a benefit. But I think, again, you've got to fund it. If you looked in Texas and you said, hey, I want to provide funding and pay everyone $1 an hour a day or $1 a day, let's just say $1 a day, you're looking at about $26 million a year that you need to pay if you want to do that. So would we mind doing that? Not at all. However, it's a big funding issue that would have to be addressed because that's certainly not a pill we could just swallow.
Right. Okay, we've seen from other countries that prisons can be spaces that look and feel very different from ours in the United States and are sometimes more effective. What do you think about the state of physical prisons, and if there are any lessons to learn about how other countries have created their space?
I think there are, and I work with other directors. I've been to Poland, I've been and looked at their system. I have not been to, say, Norway or some of the other countries that have advanced systems as well. But I think that prisons are built not with the idea that you would build them necessarily today. So I don't disagree with the way prisons, one, have to be built for security. You've got to build it so it's safe, secure, and humane space to work in. But at the same time, that's been the primary consideration in the past. That's the only consideration. But I think thinking about the rehabilitative effect of what you see, where you live each and every day, and the atmosphere you create would definitely be in the minds. And I think it is in the minds of those that are building today. But most states are not building, unfortunately. And I think modifying that space is a very difficult and expensive task to do. So for me, I don't disagree with that. I don't think they're necessarily a community college design either, because I think sometimes the security setting you need, that's not going to be sufficient. But at the same time, a balance is wise.
Okay, next question. Thank you for this informative presentation. Brian, you mentioned the impact of revocation on the prison population / recidivism within TDCJ. What is the percentage makeup of the generation population from technical revocation? So what is the percentage? No, what is the percentage makeup of the generation population from technical revocation? And that might mean general population instead of generation population. I'm not sure.
And our technical revocations in Texas run about 10% of the overall revocations. So you see a different picture if you look at our probation population, and that because you also have independent judges making those decisions all over the state. But when the parole board, they have a series and a protocol they follow as they look at violators, and they also use something called intermediate sanctions facilities, which are short-term incarceration treatment, behavioral cognitive treatment, as well as substance abuse treatment for those in lieu of revocation. And those have proven to be very effective. But about 10% of our overall parole revocations are technical.
Perfect. This is a question that's on my list, so I'm going to jump ahead to it. Can you speak to the alleged lack of air conditioning or air conditioning in most Texas prisons? Give us a little history of that and where things stand at the moment.
You bet. In Texas, we have, within our current facilities, we have 29 that have air conditioning in all housing areas. We have 50 that have partial air conditioning, meaning that some ports of the unit are air conditioned, but not all the housing areas. So, and you also have systems and prisons in Texas that were built well over 100 years ago. So we have all that model. The earliest, the most recent prison we had built that we own was actually in the mid to late 90s. So that's the oldest you have, or the youngest you have in the system. Many of those are well over 100. So what we in Texas, obviously we understand that's an issue, especially with our aging population. What we have done over the last 3 to 4 years, we also had litigation around air conditioning. So I won't ignore that at all. We had litigation around that at one facility, and we ultimately air conditioned that facility. We have continued to do pockets of air conditioning at other locations as we can. We did get funding last legislative session to air condition a facility where we have our developmentally disabled male population, and we're doing that as well. But I think moving forward, to snap your finger and say, well, let's air condition the entire system is a very expensive proposition. Not something that TDCJ is necessarily opposed to, but again, that's one of those big funding items where you could easily exceed $1 billion trying to air condition the entire system if you look at the whole package. So we look at how we can move that older, more vulnerable heat population into the 29 air conditioning facilities we have. And we've done that over the last 2 years, and we'll have that wrapped up this year, where basically if you're heat vulnerable, you will be in air conditioned housing, and we'll be able to keep up with that balance. But there'll obviously be still way more prisons in Texas unair conditioned than there are air conditioned. And we'll continue to take opportunities to do those as we can. Those obviously, some of those are less expensive than others, but at the same time, a full scale air condition across the system may happen down the road, but I think you have to take a little at a time.
Yeah. And how do you make sure the prisoners are safe in those units that are not air conditioning? And I guess none of us had air conditioning until about 1950 or whenever that came in. So a lot of these units were before that. And how do you ensure that nobody is hurt or dies from it?
We have a substantial number of heat protocols that we put in place every year in the spring, and we keep those in effect until the fall. It's everything from putting ice water up in the cell block housing areas or in the dormitory areas, to providing cups to offenders, to providing water to offenders regularly, ice water, cold water. We also have lots of informational posters, information with our staff about watching for signs and symptoms of heat-related illnesses. But we're also, I mean, we're obviously concerned about the offender population, but our employees as well. They're working in that same environment. So trying to work with both those populations to keep them safe. And for an example, during COVID, we've actually had many fewer heat-related incidents than we typically have had in a year. I think some of that's related because we're not recreating as much, doing as much outside activity that can sometimes cause that. We don't work in high temperatures. We slow down activities in high temperatures. And we basically even put in a incident command status when we reach certain temperatures in certain parts of the state, so that's all we focus on are our mitigation efforts. And we continue to do that. We learn from that, continue to learn from that, and continue to modify as we go.
Okay, we've got about 12 minutes to go and a ton of questions. I still have a lot on my list, although some of them have been hit. Let me hit a couple more. What have been some of the best in-prison rehabilitation programs that have lowered recidivism, in your opinion?
Our in-prison therapeutic community program, which is an intensive substance abuse treatment program for those that have an assessment score of inpatient need. Basically, in other words, they've been through a screening and a full assessment indicating that they are what I would call a full-blown addict. Could be alcohol, could be heroin, could be significant drug treatment. Those going through the program in prison, 6 to 9 months, 9 months for those with mental health issues or other physical issues, 6 months for those without, and then following up with that 12 months in the community, part of that being a treatment facility where you reside there, and then the rest being outpatient treatment. That program has had very good success rates in the teens for those that complete that program. And when you compare them with their like partners as well in the system who didn't receive the treatment, you see a significant difference, because that's a very tough group to treat, because those aren't your casual drug users. Those are your significant drug users. And we've seen that program be one of the most successful. And that's one of the ones the legislature enhanced in 2007 and continued to operate. It's done well, continues to do well, but we've also had good track record with our DWI program, which treats just those convicted of DWI. It does the behavioral, but also the substance abuse treatment. That has been a very effective program. And our cognitive behavioral programs, they overall will have the best bang for the buck on recidivism of just about anything you do. And that is where you're working in a classroom setting with someone to really rewire thinking and to put in logical thinking and go through, teach people how to understand what the repercussions can be of some quick decisions, impulse related decisions, and really trying to replumb the meaning of what they've been used to doing. And
do y'all allow AA and Al-Anon? Is that something that is allowed in there, or are prisoners allowed to have group meetings like that? And is that
yes, absolutely.
Maybe not an official program, but an informal program that helps?
We do. We operate AA, NA, also a wide variety of our faith-based programming, which I think has had a significant role in our effectiveness. I also think, I mean, we operate a seminary program at the Darrington unit where we go through a 4-year degree with Southwest Baptist Theological Seminary, and we put those individuals to work. The people we put in there have at least 10 more years to do before they graduate.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to be field ministers around the system, and we've deployed them throughout the system, and they work with our local chaplains to provide religious programming, but also facilitate a lot of those groups like AA and those other group activities in the system. So we've seen great success with a marriage of the rehabilitative and the faith-based programming.
Okay, another question from Lyceum directors or guests. Are you leveraging with agencies like the Texas Workforce Commission and grants to learn new skills in STEM to reduce the revolving door back in the system, truly providing real opportunities for nonviolent crimes to earn, didn't go all the way down, it just stops, but you get the idea of the question.
Yeah, and I would say yes. We work closely with the Workforce Commission, not only at the local level, because Texas has a Workforce Commission agency, but also local workforce boards in the communities. We work closely with both, but at the same time, at the state level, we working closely with their commissioners. We've created pilot programs. We have one specifically for female offenders where they're doing coding and some other things as they get out with a community college partner, and they're able to deploy that skill through the workforce funding and grant. So we do look for those opportunities as well. We also have a substantial reentry program for our female offenders where we actually have them and employers connecting before they ever get out. We provide them clothes, makeup, lots of other skills during the time that they're getting ready to release. And traditionally in classes for the last couple of years, every one of them's walked out with a job in hand as they got released and they graduated that program.
Okay, a couple more questions. We'll move fast. People of color are disproportionately represented in the prison population. What have you learned during your tenure about the conditions in our society that have made this trend and reality difficult to change or prevent? You know, I know you're not a sociologist or a policymaker, but you have been in the system for a long time. Do you have an opinion on that? And
yeah, I would say, well, we don't necessarily meet that mirror anymore. I think we did. I think there was a time when clearly, but I think if you look at our numbers in the system now, you see a very even divide between Black, white, Hispanic, almost identical numbers. So I think that has changed over the years. I do remember a time when obviously that was not the case, but I think it has changed to a large degree. But our employee workforce is a mirror of that as well. So I think that we see that working well together, and we work hard on trying to train our employees who may be from rural areas how to work with anyone, because obviously not all our incarcerated population comes from rural areas. So having people who can work with anyone from anywhere and any background is key.
this question is from me, and I feel a little bad about it because it's kind of like talking to a baseball pitcher in the 6th inning when he's come back to the dugout pitching a no-hitter, and you walk up to him and you say, hey man, you're pitching a no-hitter, great, I hope you can make it to the end. Obviously knows that when a pitcher is pitching a no-hitter after the 6th inning, nobody speaks to that pitcher. We just superstition, and we just don't even bring that up because no-hitters are so hard to get. Yep. But what I'd like to talk for a second about is prison security and escapes. So everybody knock on wood right now. No one's going to escape because I asked this question of Brian. Please knock on wood. But we'd love to give us a minute about security inside TDCJ and some of your challenges there.
We've had the biggest challenge we have with facilities is really staffing. Correctional officer staffing is a challenge, not just in Texas, it's around the country. And that's typically because low wages that are paid to correctional staff and trying to recruit and retain those individuals in a very tough work environment. But from a standpoint of escapes, TDCJ has been very fortunate over the years. We have one in the last 12 months from a treatment facility that we were able to recover very quickly and place him back in custody. But we've had a good track record of not having escapes, although when we have had them, if you go back the last 20 to 30 years, they've been ugly ones. We had 7 at one time that got out many, many years ago down in the Beeville area. And then we had many, many years ago a death row offender escape, as well as some others. So we've had some unfortunate events. Those are horrific events that are life-altering, not only for those involved, but for a system. But at the same time, for us, we continue to strive and focus on how we do security, how we control that, but at the same time, still have an environment where you can be productive.
I remember being in a prison unit years ago, and it was a geriatric unit, and it was really striking to see a geriatric unit. Um, I think our cost per prisoner is pretty low compared to most of the country. But talk to us. You mentioned a little bit earlier, but talk to us a little bit more about that population, because I think there's a pretty sizable population that are coming in, usually in their 40s, 50s, 60s is when they're getting sentenced. They're either repeat child offenders, or they're murderers who got a life sentence at about age 60. So they're going to be doing a lot of time into a situation where healthcare is going to be a challenge. Talk to us about that real quick, and then we'll see if there's any final questions from the audience.
Within TDCJ's numbers, and we're just under 20,000, or it's a little over 19 right now, that are over 55. And we track the 55 because typically someone in prison's health condition is about 10 years past their chronologic age. Because of the lifestyle they led before they get here. So we look at 55 and up, and if you look at those, about 70 to 75% of those have grown up in the system, so to speak. In other words, they've been here for many, many years. They have violent offenses, and they have been here for a long time. The remaining 25 to 30% are people who have come in with an offense, and they're 55 or older. We've definitely seen more of those in the last 10 to 15 years. The average age in prison is 40. But if you look at that subset population, we do see a percentage of those that come in, and many of those are going to be with us for a long period of time. And they bring lots of other health conditions many times, and you have to treat all those conditions, and that can be very expensive.
Is there anything that you'd like to tell us, and we only have about 3 minutes left, anything that's on your mind that people might not know, that might be unusual, that you want to talk about? And again, you don't have to answer that question, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity before we finish, if there's any information you'd really like to put in people's heads or correct any misconceptions. I think we've corrected a little bit of this idea that there's a prison industrial complex and you're just begging to have prisoners so you can make a bunch of profits for corporations. I know you do work some with outside companies there, and maybe give us a last thought on that, and any other thing you're thinking about that you'd like to impart before we leave.
Probably the number one thing I would tell everyone, no matter what state you're in or where you are, correctional employees, they're largely people out of sight, out of mind. But what I would tell you is they represent true heroes, in my opinion, because if you think about not just COVID, but all the other things that they deal with each and every day behind the walls that most people don't see. I unfortunately have to see that, and I know what they deal with, and it is substantial. And they're underpaid. They work hard. They work long hours, but at the same time, just an appreciation. I think if you think about what those individuals do to keep us all safe, it's significant. And I think the other piece is, with privatization, obviously the devil's in the details, and I think you have to pay attention to how you balance that, how you utilize that, and how you can do that for an overall gain. And I think you can find great partnerships with private vendors, as we have in Texas, but I think it requires a lot of work on both sides to be able to do that with a common goal in mind. Obviously, certainly not just some profit motive. I obviously wouldn't want to see that at all. But I think knowing what your overall mission is, having people that are focused on that can help you achieve it, can be a good for all. And I think in the right balance, that works.
When I was working for Governor Bush as a criminal justice policy director, I probably visited 50 or 60 prison units over the 5 years I was there. And I was always amazed at how well TDCJ was run. And of course, maybe there's not the right analogy, but they'd make 1,000 diving tackles every month that nobody would see, where they kept someone safe or
Right.
fed and clothed and got to work, got them up, got them to work, and got them in bed without any incidents happening, or very few. It's just amazing how well it does. And of course, no, that's not a story, that's never reported, but when something goes wrong, it's front page of the paper all over the country. So
Right.
It truly is an amazing agency. We have about 1 minute left. Let's see if there's any final questions. I think I've gotten to most of them. I guess contraband always, let's talk for 30 seconds about contraband. I remember when they made it illegal to smoke in prison and tobacco became illegal, that knocked out the drug industry in prison for a little while, because cigarettes became the new contraband. Yes. And now you're having to deal with drones and cell phones. Give us 30 seconds on contraband issues.
significant issue for all states. Cell phones are a big factor with it, and trying to get, obviously jamming has been something we've worked at as a body to try to do, but haven't been able to successfully do that as a group as far as across the country. But I think contraband, absolutely a constant battle. And just within the last week or two, we had a drone drop at one of our facilities that we were able to identify that brought in K2, methamphetamine, cell phones, and other activities. So there's probably more money at play than there ever has been in the game of contraband. I won't call it a game, but the activities of contraband, where you've got more people willing to spend a lot more money to help bring things into our system. So it's a constant battle and a constant struggle.
Well, Brian, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate, and the Lyceum appreciates you giving us this time early in the morning, although I know it's not early for you, but to come on and answer questions from all comers. We really appreciate you. We appreciate your service to the state of Texas over 35 years. I mean, it's truly unbelievable dedication to keeping our state safe and keeping our citizens safe. So the audience we can't hear them clapping, but please, give them a round of applause and thank you for what you've done. Okay, so now let me announce to the group, we're getting ready to start the second panel. So what you need to do is go to the upper left corner of your screen and click the back to session. And once you click that back to session, scroll down to the September 17th, 9 a.m. session. And the 9 a.m. session will start in just a minute. It's about private prison industries, and you're going to hear from people that are actually in the private arena, as well as other law enforcement and TDCJ that are going to talk about, teach us more about prisons and how private industry works in there. Thank you all very much for listening, and we'll see you on the other side.